Hong Ah Hung Denza Guru Pema CD Hung Ah Hung Denza Guru Pema CD Hung Ah Hung Denza Guru Pema CD Hung. Hello everyone, happy Easter. Welcome to my Sunday Dharma talk. I am Tseten and I did put some information in the chat for everyone. Please feel free to ask questions during the chat. I prefer that to saving your questions to the end, although the latter is customary. That way, if you have a question about the content, it's uppermost in your mind, my mind, and in the mind of everyone else. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. So today's Sutta, I'm sure all of you know now that we're doing a 34-week series of talks on the Digha Nikaya. This is week 24, and we're discussing the Patika Sutta, which is the 24th Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, the story of Patika Putta on this Easter Sunday. Our translator, Maurice Walsh, comments that this Sutta is the worst Sutta in the Digha Nikaya. So that's the special Sutta that we're going to be studying today on Easter Sunday. Still, we must consider its contents without regard worst in the sense of the worst quality. The worst literary quality, the most poorly made, the most poorly cobbled together, the least historically credible, etc. Still, we must consider its contents without without regard to its historicity. For non-historicity, as I have mentioned before in these talks, non-historicity is not a warrant of falsehood, and strict historicity is impossible in any case. The Buddha is staying amongst the Mallas, a brave and warlike people, who nonetheless had rejected monarchy and functioned as a republic. The small but powerful Malla state was located north of Magadha. We've encountered Malla before as the place where the Buddha took sick and died in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. Divided into 9 clan or tribal territories, each clan appointed members to the Santagara, literally the House of Assembly. Malla would be annexed by Magadha soon after the Buddha's death. The name of the town where the Buddha was staying was Anupiya. Anupiya seems to have been a mango grove. That's just about all I was able to find out about it. Getting up too early in the morning to go into the village for alms, as was his wont, we find the Buddha often up in the night and getting up very early. The Buddha resolved to visit Bhagavagota in his arama. Bhagavagota is described as a wanderer, and an arama is a park or a monastery. Walsh has hermitage. Bhagavagota welcomes the Buddha warmly. We've actually seen the structure in a previous sutta, I forget which one. But there's a sutta where the Buddha goes to visit someone in a park and he greets him warmly with the same kind of effusiveness. It's not clear whether Bhagavagota knows the Buddha, but has not seen him for a long time, or perhaps more plausibly, that he has heard of the Buddha and is favorably disposed towards him. Bhagawa asks the Buddha if it is true that Sunakata, the Lichawi, had left the Sangha, literally rule. We encountered Sunakata, the Lichawi, indirectly in Sutta 6, when Otada, the Lichawi, asks the Buddha about Sunakata's experience of divine visions, but not divine sounds. He doesn't actually appear in the sutta, but his name appears in the sutta, and Otada is asking the Buddha about this circumstance, where after 3 years of practice, Sunakata is seeing divine visions, but he's not hearing divine sounds. The Lichawis were the major clan of the Vaji Confederacy east of Malla. The Buddha confirms that Sunakata has left the Sangha and tells Bhagawa the story of his leaving with some relish. Sunakata, the Buddha says, went to the Buddha and told him that he is leaving the Sangha, perhaps with some attitude. At least that's the suggestion. And the Buddha gives the same attitude right back. The Buddha says, quote, "Did I ever say to you, join the Sangha, or did you ever say to me, I will join the Sangha?" Unquote. Sunakata admits that he had not, which begs the question of Sunakata's relationship with the Buddha. Later on, we learn that Sunakata was one of the Buddha's personal attendants, which adds a little bit of information to the sutta, because we know from other suttas that many of the Buddha's early personal attendants before Ananda were unsatisfactory in one way or another. I remember one who ran away, and clearly Sunakata is another bad apple. Suggesting the possibility of some sort of personal animosity on Sunakata's part. The Buddha was not loved by everyone. This also places the sutta between the time when the Buddha was 35 and 55 years of age, since Ananda took over as the Buddha's personal attendant when Gautama was 55. He seems to delight in chiding, challenging, and correcting the Buddha. Perhaps he had been ordained by another bhikkhu, a practice documented in the Pali Canon, so that Sunakata had never met the Buddha before becoming his personal attendant. Perhaps the Buddha's curtness is also influenced by his perception of Sunakata's hostility, which is overt in the Sihanada Sutta, which appears as the 12th sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, where he openly attacks the Buddha before the Vesali assembly of the Vajjayans. In any case, the Buddha rebukes Sunakata for his importunity. Quote, "So, Sunakata, if I did not say to you, and you did not say that to me, if I did not say that to you, and you did not say that to me, you foolish man, who are you, and what are you giving up? Consider, foolish man, how far the fault is yours." Unquote. The Buddha seems to be saying, don't look to me because you've left the order, look to yourself, for the karma is yours. The impression is that Sunakata is giving up something of great value without realizing it, and this is why the Buddha apparently derides him. Sunakata then complains to the Buddha that the Buddha has not performed any miracles or taught the beginning of things. The Buddha reminds Sunakata that he never promised to perform miracles or teach the beginning of things. The Buddha tells Sunakata that the purpose of his teaching is the attainment of the cessation of angst or dukkha, and that neither miracles nor teachings concerning the beginning of things are relevant to this goal. The Buddha observes that in the past, Sunakata has praised the Buddha to the Vajjayans. In so doing, he describes the Dharma as, quote, "visible here and now, timeless, inviting inspection, leading onward to be realized by the wise, each one for himself." So let's unpack this a little. And this explanation of those phrases is a little bit esoteric, so I'm going to put them in the chat. So the first phrase was visible here and now. This means that the Dharma is experienced in the moment. In this sense, it is the essential truth of reality. Thus, the moment itself is the essential reality. The moment is the Dharma, and the Dharma is the moment. Timeless. The Dharma is timeless. The moment is outside time. Thus, Dharma is the permanent, changeless truth of reality. It is immortal, and it confers the immortality, the deathless, repeated frequently throughout the Pali Canon. The Dharma invites inspection. It is both attractive because it confers happiness, and it is susceptible to analytical evaluation. The Dharma leads onward. It is a progressive praxis that builds on itself and so confers ever-increasing insight, culminating in enlightenment itself. The Dharma is realized by the wise. The Dharma is the essential salvific principle, a point I have emphasized throughout all of my talks, and is therefore only attainable by those who know, that is, who have right view. And finally, each one for himself. The path is unique, and only available through the direct realization of the individual. Although individuals may choose to walk together, a paradoxical statement given that there is no self, that's the doctrine of anatta, of course, but also pointing beyond no self to the mental continuum or mind stream, which brings us back to the moment. So we've come full circle. So Nakata also praised the Sangha in terms of the four pairs of men, who are the stream entrants, the once-returners, the non-returners, and the arahants, multiplied by two, whether they are seekers or finders, that is, whether they are aspiring towards that state or have attained that state, thereby creating the 8 classes of individuals. And we've discussed these grades of attainment before in other talks, so I'm not going to go into them more thoroughly than that. Stream entrant, once-returner, non-returner, and arahant. The Sangha is described as, quote, worthy of respect, worthy of homage, worthy of gifts, worthy of salutation, an unsurpassed field in the world for merit, unquote. This passage alludes to a somewhat disconcerting Buddhist doctrine for some Westerners, that the amount of merit one generates, either for oneself or others, is directly proportional to the merit of the recipient of the act, if there is a recipient, of course. And in the case of renunciation, where the recipient of merit is oneself, the better renouncer one is, the higher the quality of the merit that one generates for oneself. In the words of Yeshua, Jesus, quote, for whoever has, it will be given to him, and whoever has not, even that which he has will be taken away from him, unquote. That's from Mark chapter 4, verse 25. Jesus or Yeshua seems to be alluding to exactly the same sort of idea there. This then becomes a karmic energy bank that can be saved, drawn upon, used, and transferred, just like money. This comparison might startle some folk, but Buddhism was as successful as it was in India largely due to the commercial class, the commercial or mercantile classes, who became members of the Sangha and endowed it with parks, monasteries, and other gifts. Thus, mercantile references and concepts did enter the Pali Canon. The quality of one's personal merit accelerates exponentially. For this reason, absent the Buddha, the true Sangha is the greatest source of merit, the actual repository of Dharma. This may be understood as a direct consequence of the law of karma, which underlies the merit generation process. Merit is simply the positive quality of unfruited karmas that inhere in one's nature due to the quality of one's intentions expressed in words, thoughts, and deeds, body, speech, and mind. The political implication of this doctrine is also... I see a question. Jospe asks, could one think for this reason that it is a good thing that Buddha is such a merchandise these days? What I would say about that is it is quite remarkable that the Dharma transmission to the West is occurring at the apex of the mercantile historical process, which really was in its early stages in northeast India at the Buddha's time, as it was elsewhere in the world. And now we are at the midpoint, at the precise midpoint of the Buddhist epoch. We are at clearly the apex of the development of historical capitalism. And now the Dharma transmission to the West, which originated in the context of a mercantilist culture, which flourished because of it, which was distributed because of it, and now it's coming to the West to transform Western mercantile culture. I think that is quite a remarkable synchronicity. So that's what I would say about that. The political implication of this doctrine is also apparent. The Sangha operates as a kind of collective social conscience, devoid of obvious power, yet influential, close to the people through the tie of alms, not involved in money, business, trade, politics, or the householder world, internally based on a hierarchy of respect, common property, and mutually consensual discourse. Such an organization creates a karmic counterpart, or polarity, perhaps, to the inherent tendency of samsara to degeneration, thus maintaining the tone of society without being involved in government, and therefore the corruption to which government is prone. Only a sangha that functions in this way, and not all Buddhist sanghas in the world today do function in this way, but only a sangha that functions in just this way conforms to the Buddha's intention. The Buddha told Sunakata that people will say that he left the sangha because he couldn't handle the rules, and the text says, quote, Sunakata left this dhamma and discipline like one condemned to hell, quote unquote. Here the sutta breaks off into a series of 3 short tales told by the Buddha, all designed to denigrate Sunakata. Walsh notes that this is the only sutta in the Pali Canon, probably, he says, it's probably the only sutta in the Pali Canon in which the Buddha relates a narrative as distinct from a discourse to a third party. The tale that the Buddha tells to Bhagawa, it relates an incident in the Buddha's life that occurred at a place called Uttaraka, amongst the Kulus, or possibly the Burus. The name of this obscure tribe is uncertain, and I could find no information concerning them. One morning, the Buddha went into Uttaraka with Sunakata as his attendant, and at that time a naked ascetic by the name of Korakatiya, literally means dog man, was going about the town on all fours. This kind of asceticism seems to have been popular in Asia. Saniya is another ascetic in the Pali Canon, mentioned in the Pali Canon, who emulated a dog. Like the Chinese Taoist mystic Geishuan, who lived between 164 and 244 of the Common Era, who went about as a pig for 7 years in order to prove his holiness. Just as an amusing aside, Aleister Crowley actually claimed to be the reincarnation of Geishuan. Sunakata was much impressed by Korakatiya, to the Buddha's consternation. When the Buddha questions Sunakata's judgment, Sunakata is defensive. Quote, does the Blessed Lord begrudge others their arhatship? Unquote. The Buddha's answer is revealing. Quote, I do not begrudge others their arhatship, you foolish man. It is only in you that this evil view has arisen. Unquote. The Buddha's answer echoes Kassapa's reference to Brahman ascetics in Sutta 23, which I also noticed with interest during that talk. He recognizes implicitly that those of other persuasions are capable of arhatship. Nevertheless, the Buddha's objection to Sunakata's implicit accusation of bias or perhaps sectarianism is that Korakatiya has no following. The Buddha's objection to Korakatiya is that he is generating the karma of his own downfall and therefore cannot be on the right path because his fruit is bad. In another sutta, the Buddha explains, and we actually talked about this, the Buddha explains how the fruit of Dharma is always good. To prove this, the Buddha predicts that Korakatiya will die of indigestion before long, and so he did. The Buddha predicts that Korakatiya will be reborn amongst the asuras, the anti-gods, who we have also discussed in past talks, so I'm not going to go into further explanation of the asuras. The sutta gives us a rare glimpse into the typology of the asuras, however, so we will go into that. He says that Korakatiya will be reborn amongst the Kalakanjas, or another variant of that name is Kalakeyas, the very lowest grade of asura. We have met these beings once before in Sutta 20, where they appear amongst the host of devas who worship the Buddha and are called terrible to behold, quote unquote. In Hinduism, these were a powerful, cruel and ferocious clan of Danavas, a race descending from Daksha, one of the sons of Lord Brahma, who hid themselves in the sea in order to avoid Indra after he killed their leader, the demon Vryutra Asura. In Buddhist lore, the Kalakanjas are said to suffer from excessive thirst, rather like the Chinese conception of hungry ghosts. The Chinese word is erkwe, and the Pali is peta. The Kalakanjas also resemble the petas in shape, sex life, diet, and longevity. They also intermarry with them, thus establishing that different classes of beings in the Buddhist sixfold classification of beings, I'm sure you're all familiar with that, devas, humans, animals, asuras, hell beings, ghosts, animals. Different classes of beings can intermarry in the Buddhist worldview. An interesting concept suggestive of Star Trek, which explores the prospect of sex with extraterrestrials quite openly, and is in fact explicitly practiced by at least one religion, of which I'm aware. In Haiti, in the religion of Vodun, an individual can marry their Loi, their spiritual guardian, in a legal ceremony which is legally recognized as a marriage by the state. The Buddha invites Sanakata to verify this for himself, which he does by performing an act of what amounts to necromancy, or necromancy, the magical art of divining using corpses. With the corpse of Korak Katya, which he finds thrown aside on a heap of grass in a charnel ground. Striking the body 3 times with his hand, Sunakata cries out, "Friend Korakatiya, do you know your fate?" quote unquote. The corpse sits up, rubs his back with his hand, and says, quote, "Friend Sunakata, I know my fate. I have been reborn amongst the Kalakanja Asuras," quote unquote. The corpse then falls back, once again dead as a doornail. This type of divination was reputedly performed by witches and sorcerers during the European Middle Ages, and is clearly a universal archetype. Afterwards, the Buddha reminds Sunakata of his complaint that the Buddha has not performed a miracle. Sunakata admits that he has and leaves the Sangha in disgrace. The Buddha tells another parallel story, which took place at the Gabled Hall in the great forest of Vesali, the capital of the Vajis. I'm tempted to mention parallel universes here, since Sunakata can only leave the Sangha once, but perhaps that may be a stretch. Here he tells the story of Kala Mutaka. Sorry. Actually, I'm not sure if it's Kalara or Kala. That's a good question. I'll have to check that. I have both spellings in my talk. So it's either Kalara Mutaka or Kala Mutaka, who had undertaken 7 rules of practice. First, living as a naked ascetic. Second, chastity. Third, subsisting on strong meat and drink, rather like the tantrics, and abstaining from boiled rice and sour milk. And numbers 4 through 7, remaining within a square defined by 4 shrines. The Udina shrine in the east, the Gautamaka shrine in the south, the Satamba shrine in the west, and the Bahaputta shrine in the north. And I actually intended to look up to see what I could find out about those presumably Vedic shrines, but I didn't get around to it. So if anyone would be interested in looking those up and giving me information about them, I can put them in the written version of the talk. Sunakata went to visit Kala Mutaka and asked him a question that he could not answer, whereupon Kala Mutaka, seems to be Kala Mutaka, became enraged. Sunakata felt that Kala Mutaka was a true arhat. He seems to have some questionable taste in arhats. So he withdrew out of fear that he had or might offend the ascetic. And the Buddha reminds Sunakata of this and prophesies that Kala Mutaka will become a married householder and lose his reputation as an ascetic. And so it came about. Sunakata is made to acknowledge his error and leaves the Sangha in disgrace. Perhaps these are past life stories, although there is no indication in the Sutta that they are. A third time, the Buddha tells a parallel story, this time of Patika, the name that seems to be referenced in the title of the sutta. A naked ascetic also living in Vesali, Patika claimed to be able to make twice as many miracles as the Buddha and challenged the Buddha to a contest. But the Buddha says that Patika is not capable of meeting him face to face. Curiously, Sunakata asks the Buddha if the Buddha knows this from his own knowledge, or has he been told by a deva. The Buddha answers that he knows it both from his own knowledge and from devas. This stock passage appears in other suttas too, implying that the Buddha could communicate with devas and that the Dharma was at least partly inspired by them. And we also know that there were deva followers of the Buddha as well. The Buddha tells Sunakata to invite Patika to come to him in Patika park any time. Hearing of this, many Lichawis, the sutta improbably says in the hundreds and thousands, came to Patika park to see the contest, but Patika, afraid, tries to hide out in the Tenduka wanderer's lodging. This flowering insect-resistant tree, the Tenduka, is long-lived, slow-growing, and tall, with a thick black trunk and round yellow astringent fruits. The assembled company sends several people to persuade him to come, but Patika cannot move off his seat, try as he might, like a man hypnotized. Jalya, a pupil of the wooden bowl ascetic, who appears in Suttas 6 and 7 as well, compares Patika to a jackal who feeds off the leavings of the Buddha lion. Instead, the Buddha gives a Dharma talk in Patika park, which, quote, delivered them all from the great bondage, quote unquote. The meaning of this statement is somewhat obscure and could mean anything from entering the path to experiencing emancipation. Entering into jhana by, quote, the method of flame, unquote, the Buddha rises into the air and projects a beam of light that blazes and sheds fragrance, and teleported to the gabled hall of the great forest. Incidentally, the height to which the Buddha rose is the same as the length of the beam of light, which is equal to the height of 7 palm trees, perhaps 200 to 400 meters square. Note the recurrence of the symbolic number 7, which we frequently encounter in the Pali Canon. Once again, the Buddha shamed Sunakata into admitting that he had performed a miracle, whereupon Sunakata left the Sangha in disgrace. After having told these stories, the Buddha says to Bhagawa, quote, Bhagawa, I know the first beginning of things, and I know not only that, but what surpasses it in value. And I am not under the sway of what I know, and not being under its sway, I have come to know for myself that quenching, the Pali word is nibbutthi, by the realization of which the Tathagata cannot fall into perilous paths. The Pali word is anaya, which literally means misfortune, unquote. Here the Buddha explains somewhat his antipathy to speculative metaphysics, not because there are no such truths. We have the statement, I know the first beginnings of things, but because they are of lesser value and because they can lead to attachment that can lead to rebirth in just such a world as one imagines, and so continue to experience angst. This is an objection to ontology that the Buddha makes in another sutta. That you have, whatever positive conception of emancipation you might have, that positive conception will, at birth, translate into rebirth in a world corresponding to that positive conception. In other words, emancipation in and of itself is utterly uncharacterizable. Signless, as he says in one of the suttas. To demonstrate his knowledge, the Buddha launches into a discourse on theism, similar to what we encountered in Sutta 11. In just this way, Kant says in his Prolegomena to any future metaphysics that, quote, these prolegomena are not for the use of pupils, but of future teachers, and even the latter should not expect that they will be serviceable for the systematic exposition of a ready-made science, but merely for the discovery of the science itself. These prolegomena, however, are designed for preparatory exercises. They are intended to point out what must be done in order to make a science actual, if it is possible, rather than to expound it, unquote. The Buddha says that he went to those ascetics and Brahmins who believe that everything begins with creation by a god or by God. But they were unable to give a reasonable answer to how this came about. We've talked about the Buddhist view of cosmology before. The Buddha says that when the world contracts, beings are reborn in the Abhasara Brahma world, Abhasara, which actually refers to the top plane of the radiant devas, which are next above the Brahma world. So we're seeing a little disconnect here between our understanding of the Buddhist cosmology and the author of the suttas. He's identifying the Abhasara world as a Brahma world, whereas it's beyond the Brahma worlds in our modern conception of Buddhist cosmology. Then, when the world expands again, a deva falls into what he calls, quote, an empty Brahma palace, unquote, like the empty mansion where Payasi was reborn in the Payasi Sutta, Sutta 24 in the Digha Nikaya, which we've just recently discussed, last week, in fact. Experiencing loneliness, other beings appear, and he and they all believe that he created them. Thus, the belief in theism comes about as a delusion, which is perhaps why theists seem to be so prone to delusion and the violence and dysfunctional behaviors which are associated with delusion. This story is told in other suttas too. The Buddha goes on to explain the origin of the corrupted by pleasure and corrupted in mind devas, which we discussed briefly in Sutta 1, but without really going into an explanation of them. Here is our opportunity to learn a little more about the corrupted by pleasure and the corrupted in mind devas. Such beings fall into lower realms because of excessive merriment or envy, respectively, and thus give rise to beliefs that the world is caused by sensual or mental corruption. Finally, he explains the origin of the unconscious devas, the asannyasata, who occupy the 10th plane of samsara from the top, or the 22nd plane counting from the bottom. The unconscious devas are so called. Unconscious devas are quite a high rebirth, incidentally. They're not a low rebirth. The unconscious devas are so called because they sought to escape angst in unconscious meditative states. So that's their mistake. They are advanced spiritual practitioners who have focused on generating unconsciousness in order to escape suffering, and falling into that error are reborn in an unconscious state. These beings are associated with the belief that the world arises according to chance. The unconscious devas are reborn with no memory, thus concluding that everything comes out of non-being by chance. Interestingly, this state is not too unlike that of secular humans, who also believe that everything arises because of chance, because memories of past births are rare. In fact, although in secular materialism, of course, they are denied entirely. The Buddha complains that others accuse him of being on the wrong track, the viparito, declaring that whoever has reached the grade of the beautiful, the Pali word is subha, referring to the third liberation in Sutta 15, you'll recall the list of 8 liberations concluded in which the 4 formless jhanas were featured. Walsh interprets the beautiful as a jhana-like stage of concentration. So the Buddha's complaint is that others accuse him of being on the wrong track because he teaches that the grade of the beautiful, that one who has reached the grade of the beautiful finds everything repulsive. And we've addressed this question of repulsiveness as a response to sensuality in connection with the meditation on the repulsiveness of the body in Sutta 22. However, the Buddha says he does not teach this. Rather, the Buddha says that whoever attains to the grade of the beautiful experiences it, and that's an ambiguous antecedent. Is he referring to the grade? Is he referring to existence? He experiences it as beautiful. This seems similar to the experience of the Buddha's mother, Queen Maya, during her gestation of the Buddha, in which it is said that she experienced everything around her, the world around her, in a state of heightened, refined pleasure that was completely non-sensual. A heightened aesthetic state, in other words. The Buddha tells Bhagawa that it is hard for him, as a follower of a different philosophy, to attain the state called the beautiful. That is to say, of course, it's hard for Bhagawa. However, Bhagawa says, although he belongs to a different sect, he will place his trust in the Buddha, an ambiguous statement at best that might imply conversion, merely an appreciation of the Buddha, or perhaps even a polite exit. Finally, in conclusion, with reference to the slide behind me, which I'm sure you've all been looking at with interest, this is an image of an apocryphal miracle allegedly performed by the Buddha, described in several commentaries. Called the Yamaka Pataharya, the twin or double miracle, the Buddha's body becomes luminous, and streams of water and flames of fire begin to emanate from opposite sides, above and below, to the left and right, in a rapidly, continuously alternating sequence between fire and water, a kind of light, luminous display of oscillating light. While in this state, the Buddha walked up and down, teaching the Dharma according to the dispositions of the audience and performing miracles for 16 days. Afterwards, the Buddha went to the Tawatimsa heaven, the world of the 33 gods, and taught the Abhidhamma to his mother, Maya, who had been reborn there as a deva. The myth reminds us of the transfiguration of Christ, and is thus a fitting symbol for Easter Sunday. According to the questions of King Milinda, only a Buddha can perform the twin miracle, which is therefore a sign of his Buddhahood. Symbolically, it clearly alludes to the quaternary and also to the concept of the interdependence and interactivity of opposites, as well as the aerial luminous phenomena that indicate the presence of the divine. And note that this story is not Mahayana. It is in the Theravada commentaries. That concludes my talk for today. Thank you very much for your attention. Before we conclude with the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate whatever merit has been generated by this talk to all beings, does anyone have any questions or discussion they would like to have about this sutta? I see a question from Jospe. Is there a sutta where Buddha teaches the Abhidhamma? Of course. There is an Abhidhamma. The only complete Abhidhamma we have, I believe, is that of the Theravadins. Every Hinayana sect had its own Abhidhamma, whereas they shared the suttas, the Abhidhammas were all different. And the Pali Abhidhamma has been translated into English by the Pali Text Society, and I'm sure pieces of it, parts of it are also translated by others. It is the third part of the Pali Canon. As I said, every Hinayana sect had its own. It's considered to be, ironically, it is considered in the mythology, it is considered to be the apex, the ultimate synthesis of the Buddha's teachings. But in fact, the Abhidhammas of the various sects are the most sectarian productions, and are certainly did not originate with the Buddha, with the historical Buddha, and are definitely post-Sutta books, writings. I think scholars believe they were written in the 3rd century, the Abhidhamma. Can I advise what to read in terms of the Abhidhamma? I avoid the Abhidhamma personally. There is I don't know if there is an anthology of Abhidhamma writings. There is the Pali Text. I would look up Abhidhamma Pali Text Society and see what they have available. Only the Pali Text Society has translated the entire thing, I believe. And they're old translations, probably. I personally have a translation on Buddhist psychology by Rhys Davids, which is from the Abhidhamma, but I don't really study the Abhidhamma, so I don't have any specific recommendations. But I'm sure you could find I'm sure you could find things online. Any other questions before we conclude with the dedication of merit? Oh, my goodness. Okay, here we have a big question from Jospe. Under NR 1.6, I'm not sure what the NR stands for. Under 1.6, Sanakata, the Lichawi, left the Buddha because the Buddha supposed that the people would look down on Sanakata for leaving the disciplined life. And then alternative under number 110, Sanakata the Lichawi leaves after the miracle of dead men speaking the Buddha arranged for him. Then later in line 114, Sanakata leaves the Buddha again because of his miracle birth. Yes, this is the multiple stories with each time he's leaving over and over again. Am I mistaking here in misreading the text, or did Sanakata Lichawi leave the Buddha several times? No, according to the story, he left the Buddha several times. Now, you can interpret that in different ways. I didn't interpret it as an actual sequence of leavings. That would be pretty weird, and I think improbable. I think of it as a series of alternative stories, explaining perhaps the leaving. Perhaps the Sutta is a compilation of different oral traditions which are being very awkwardly spliced together in this Sutta. That's a possible explanation. I did mention parallel universes humorously. I'm not seriously citing those as evidence for a Buddhist theory of a multiverse. Actually, now that I think about it, I like the theory. I think the most likely explanation is simply that this Sutta, which is obviously very much spliced together, and you'll notice that a lot of suttas are like this, although not quite as blatantly so. You'll find suttas spliced into other suttas in the Pali Canon, so it's not a unique phenomenon. I think probably these are alternative oral traditions that existed when the Pali Canon was compiled, and were spliced together into the Sutta because there was no basis in which to choose between them, or the editors did not want to make a choice, which you also find in the Pali Canon. And paradoxically, the very fact that was done in that way gives us confidence that the traditions that were circulating at the time that the Pali Canon was compiled were in fact collected, that there was an attempt being made by the editors of the Pali Canon to collect together all of the available material. That seems to me to be the most likely explanation. A second question is this. We have spoken more often about Buddha being unwilling to do miracles, and miracles in the suttas could probably be put in afterwards in order to glorify the Buddha. How do you look at these particular miracles in this respect in this sutta, one dead man talking and 3 foretellings? I look at it exactly as you say. I don't look at it historically at all. However, I don't make the mistake, and it is a mistake in my judgment, that because it's a telling, if you want to use that, that's quite a nice word actually that you used. Because a telling is non-historical does not mean that it does not contain valid insights. So Dharma can be expressed in non-historical, mythological ways. And clearly this, although Theravadins today like to portray themselves as strict historicists, these texts are all canonical. And therefore, what we're dealing with is a revisionist Theravada view, or a neo-Theravada view, not the original Theravada sect, which regarded all of these texts as canonical. And by canonical, that simply meant that they regarded them as containing valid and authoritative insights. That canonicity does not necessarily imply historicity, and it's an intellectual mistake to say that because a text is non-historical, therefore it is false and should be ignored. That is not a legitimate inference at all. So I look at them, I tell the story, I look at the details, I try to understand the story and the doctrines underlying it, which is really what is important. It's not the historicity of the stories that is important, it's the doctrines implicit in them. And there actually is, despite the cobbled together and obviously fantastical nature of the stories, there is actually some good texts in there, including some quite beautiful texts that because we've taken this liberal, eclectic, open-minded attitude, we are able to benefit from. Whereas a strict historicist fundamentalist, whatever is good in this Sutta is lost to them. Any other questions before we proceed? I will be retiring to Zhangzhung, to the circle, if anyone's interested in chatting after the talk, which is in the Visit Atoll Sim. So it seems no one else has any questions, so let's proceed with the dedication of merit. Whatever understanding, whatever positive force has come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you very much for this opportunity once again to discuss Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege until next Sunday when we will be discussing the 25th Sutta of the Pali Canon. Namaskar.